That summer, a Canadian rescue team received an emergency distress signal from deep within the barren tundra. No roads, no cell service, no sign of civilization for hundreds of miles. When the float plane touched down at a remote village, they found a 17-year-old boy lying unconscious on a cot in a tiny medical station. His scalp ripped open, 3 deep claw marks carved down to the bone on his back, burning with a fever of nearly 104 degrees.
He had just been mauled by a barren-ground grizzly bear, and his 5 friends had paddled a canoe through the wilderness for 4 straight days to keep him alive.
My name is Leonard. I've traveled through 47 countries, slept in the Amazon rainforest, crossed the Sahara Desert on foot. But the story I'm about to tell you today still sends chills down my spine every single time I think about it. Before we begin, drop a comment and let me know, where in the world are you listening from right now? And if you haven't subscribed to this channel yet, hit that subscribe button, because trust me, you do not want to miss how this one ends. The summer of 2005 was one of the hottest Minneapolis had seen in years. The sidewalks shimmered with heat, the lakes were packed with swimmers, and the suburbs hummed with the lazy rhythm of a Midwestern July. But for one teenager in a quiet neighborhood on the outskirts of the city, that summer was about to become something far more than backyard barbecues and late nights at the lake. He wasn't the loudest kid in a room, and he wasn't the quietest either. He was the one sitting by the window, studying the weather, wondering what it would feel like to be somewhere truly wild. There was a calmness about him that people mistook for shyness, but it wasn't that. It was patience. The kind of patience that comes from spending years listening to stories about places most people only see in documentaries.
He wasn't the loudest kid in a room, and he wasn't the quietest either. He was the one sitting by the window, studying the weather, wondering what it would feel like to be somewhere truly wild. There was a calmness about him that people mistook for shyness, but it wasn't that. It was patience. The kind of patience that comes from spending years listening to stories about places most people only see in documentaries. Those stories came from his uncle. Mike Messenger was a former National Guard serviceman in his late 40s, a broad-shouldered man with sun-weathered skin and hands that looked like they'd been carved from oak. He had a thick salt and pepper mustache, deep-set eyes that always seemed to be calculating something, and a voice that carried the quiet authority of someone who had seen real danger and come out the other side. Uncle Mike was the one who taught Alex how to read a river, how to build a fire with wet wood, how to stay calm when every instinct told you to run. Every Saturday afternoon, Mike would sit on the back porch with Alex, a cup of black coffee in one hand and a topographic map in the other, and he would talk. Not about war, not about politics, about the wilderness, about the raw, indifferent beauty of a world that existed long before humans and would exist long after. For Alex, Uncle Mike wasn't just family. He was a blueprint for the kind of man Alex wanted to become. So when the opportunity came to join a 600-mile canoe expedition through the remote wilderness of northern Canada, from the forests of Manitoba all the way up to the barren tundra near Hudson Bay, Alex didn't hesitate, not even for a second. The trip was organized by an outdoor youth training program designed for young people who craved something real, something that couldn't be found in a classroom or on a screen. The rules were simple. No phones, no outside contact, no rescue unless you triggered the emergency satellite beacon. And even then, help could be days away. You carried your own food, paddled your own canoe, and survived on your own strength. The group was made up of 6 members, and each one of them brought something different to the team. Dan Fisher was 18, the oldest of the group. He was tall and solidly built, with short-cropped dark hair and a square jaw that made him look older than his years. Dan had the kind of steady, unshakable presence that made people feel safe, just by standing near him. He rarely raised his voice, rarely panicked, and had more canoeing experience than anyone else in the group. He was the anchor. Mike Brandt, 17, was the opposite. Shorter, stockier, with a mop of curly red hair and a grin that never seemed to leave his face. Mike was the group's engine of morale. He told jokes when people were exhausted, sang off-key when the rain wouldn't stop, and had a gift for making the worst moments feel survivable just by being himself. Jean-Pierre Moreau, who everyone called JP, was 17, French-Canadian, with olive skin, dark eyes, and a quiet intensity that set him apart. He understood the northern landscape in a way the others didn't. He knew the plants, the weather patterns, the behavior of the animals, and he could cook. Even with the most basic rations, JP could turn a handful of oats and dried fish into something that almost tasted like a meal. Augie Wallace was the youngest at 16. Small for his age, with a thin frame, pale skin, and round wire-rimmed glasses that fogged up every time he leaned over the campfire. He looked like the last person you'd send into the wilderness. But Augie had something the others were still developing. An iron stubbornness that refused to quit no matter how bad things got. He carried a small waterproof notebook and wrote in it every single night, recording the journey in careful, deliberate handwriting. And then there was Dylan Park, 18, the group's semi-professional guide, and the only one who had traveled part of this route before. Dylan was lean and angular, with sun-bleached hair pulled back in a short ponytail, and a calm, methodical way of moving that suggested he never wasted energy. He checked the maps each morning, planned the route, and made decisions with a quiet confidence that the others instinctively trusted. The first days on the river were humbling. Alex had practiced canoeing on lakes near home, but nothing could have prepared him for the power of a real wilderness river. On the second day, he capsized trying to navigate a small set of rapids. The water was 8 degrees Celsius. It hit him like a wall of ice, flooding his lungs with shock, dragging him under for a terrifying second before he clawed his way to the surface. Dan Fisher pulled him out, dripping and shivering, and said the only thing that needed to be said. "Everyone flips the first time. What matters is you don't flip the next time." The evenings were a battle of their own. They pitched camp along the riverbanks, boiled water on small alcohol stoves, and hung their wet clothes on branches to dry. And then came the mosquitoes. Not the ordinary kind. These were tundra mosquitoes, dense clouds of them that descended at dusk and didn't leave until dawn. Augie's face swelled up so badly after the first few nights that he could barely see through his eyes. But he just laughed and called it free endurance training. Slowly, the group found its rhythm. Each person fell into a role, each role became essential, and the 6 of them began to move as one unit. By the end of the first week, Alex realized something that would stay with him for the rest of his life. This trip was not just an adventure. It was a transformation. Out here, there was no mother reminding him to wear a jacket, no father fixing what he broke. There was only the river, the sky, and the question of what kind of person he was going to be. Back in Minneapolis, Karen Messenger marked each day on the kitchen calendar with a red X. She had agreed to no contact. She understood the rules. But understanding and enduring are 2 very different things. Every night she sat at the dinner table, staring at Alex's empty chair, wondering if he was warm, if he was eating, if he was safe. Her husband Dan reassured her that their son was tougher than she thought. But even he sometimes stood in the doorway of Alex's bedroom, looking at the empty bed. Uncle Mike visited every weekend, spreading his maps across the kitchen table, tracing the route with his finger, and saying things like, "If everything's on schedule, they should be right about here by now." Karen looked at the map and saw nothing but a vast green emptiness with no roads, no towns, no hospitals, and somewhere in that emptiness was her son.
By the second week, the river had changed. It was no longer the wide, forgiving waterway that had carried them through those first uncertain days. It had narrowed, twisted, and developed a personality of its own. One moment it was calm, almost glassy, reflecting the endless gray sky above like a sheet of polished steel.
The next moment, around a blind bend, it would erupt into a stretch of violent whitewater that roared so loud the boys had to shout just to hear each other. The transition between peace and chaos happened without warning, and it taught them something that no classroom ever could. Nature does not announce its intentions. It simply acts, and you either adapt or you suffer.
The portages were the worst. When the rapids were too dangerous to paddle through, the group had no choice but to haul their canoes and gear overland, carrying everything on their backs through dense underbrush, over slippery, moss-covered rocks, and across terrain that seemed designed to break ankles. Each canoe weighed close to 80 pounds, and with the packs of food, equipment, and supplies strapped to their shoulders, the boys staggered forward like soldiers on a forced march.
Alex's shoulders were raw and red by the end of the first portage. By the third, the skin had split open and bled into his shirt. He didn't complain. None of them did. Complaining required energy, and energy was something they could no longer afford to waste. Some days, the river was too shallow to paddle at all. They had to climb out of their canoes and wade through knee-deep water, dragging the boats behind them over beds of loose gravel and jagged stone. The water was cold. Not refreshing cold. Not bracing cold. It was the kind of cold that seeped into your bones and stayed there, numbing your legs from the waist down until you couldn't feel your feet anymore. They would stumble forward for hours, teeth chattering, legs like wooden posts, and when they finally pulled themselves back into the canoes, the relief lasted only until the next shallow stretch appeared. The weather turned against them with a cruelty that felt almost personal. The Canadian tundra in summer operates by its own rules. Daytime temperatures could climb to a pleasant 25 degrees Celsius, warm enough to dry their clothes and lift their spirits. But as soon as the sun dipped below the horizon, the temperature plummeted to near freezing, and the nights became long, shivering ordeals spent curled inside sleeping bags that never quite felt warm enough. And then there was the rain. It came on the 14th day, not as a passing shower, but as a 3-day siege. A relentless horizontal rain driven by wind that cut through every layer of clothing they had. It wasn't the kind of rain you wait out. It was the kind of rain that moves in and refuses to leave, soaking everything. Their clothes, their sleeping bags, their food supplies, the firewood, the ground beneath their tent. Everything was wet. Everything was cold. JP spent 2 hours on the first evening trying to coax a fire from soaked wood, blowing on tiny sparks until his face was flushed and his lungs ached. Nothing caught. The wood was too saturated, the wind too strong, and the rain too constant. It was Dylan who finally solved the problem. He remembered something he had learned on his previous trip through the region. He walked to a fallen birch tree, knelt down, and peeled away strips of bark from the sheltered underside of the trunk, where the rain hadn't reached. Birch bark contains oils that burn even when damp, and within minutes, a small flame flickered to life beneath a makeshift shelter of stacked rocks and a tarp. That tiny fire became the most important thing in the world that night. The 6 of them huddled around it, steam rising from their soaked jackets and pants. No one speaking, but every one of them smiling. Because as long as there was fire, there was warmth. And as long as there was warmth, they could keep going. But the food situation was becoming a real problem. They had packed carefully before the trip, measuring out rations for each day with mathematical precision. What they hadn't accounted for was how much energy the wilderness would demand from their bodies. Paddling against current for 8 to 10 hours a day, hauling canoes over portages, shivering through freezing nights. Their caloric expenditure was far beyond anything they had estimated. The meals shrank steadily. In the first week, dinner had been rice mixed with beans and dried meat, a hearty portion that filled the belly and fueled the next morning's paddle. By the second week, it was oatmeal cooked thin with water, barely enough to silence the hunger. JP took it upon himself to supplement their diet. Every time they stopped to make camp, he would grab a fishing line and head to the nearest deep pool or eddy. The rivers in this part of Canada held Arctic grayling and northern pike, beautiful silver fish that tasted like heaven when cooked over an open flame. But fishing in the wild is not like fishing in a stocked pond. Some days JP pulled in 3 or 4 fish, and the group ate like kings. Other days, the line came back empty, and dinner was a cup of thin porridge divided 6 ways. On those nights, the hunger was visible on every face. Augie, who was already the thinnest of the group, began to withdraw. He spoke less at meal times, wrote longer in his journal at night, and stared at the river with an expression that was hard to read. Mike Brandt tried to keep spirits up with his usual jokes and impressions, but the laughter came slower now, and sometimes not at all. Alex could feel something shifting within the group. It was not conflict, not anger. It was a quiet, creeping exhaustion that lived not just in their muscles, but in their minds. The wilderness was wearing them down, and they were only halfway through. The insects made everything worse. The mosquitoes had been terrible from the start, but as they moved further north, a new torment arrived. Black flies. They were tiny, almost invisible, but their bites were vicious. Unlike mosquitoes, which pierce and drink, black flies tear the skin, leaving small wounds that bleed and itch for days. They swarmed in thick clouds, crawling into ears, nostrils, the corners of eyes. Augie's ears swelled up so badly they looked like small balloons, red and shiny and painful to touch. The boy said nothing about it. He simply pulled his hood tighter and kept paddling. Dan Fisher, watching from the stern of his canoe, felt genuine worry settle into his chest for the first time. That evening, he pulled Dylan aside near the edge of camp where the others couldn't hear. He asked whether they should consider adjusting the route, cutting the trip short before someone got seriously hurt. Dylan listened, his face calm and unreadable in the fading light. Then he shook his head. The route they were on had only one safe direction, and that was forward. Going back meant retracing rapids they had barely survived the first time. Staying put meant running out of food in a place where no one would find them. The only option was to keep moving north. And yet, the wilderness wasn't only cruelty. There were moments of such staggering beauty that they erased, at least temporarily, every ounce of suffering. One afternoon, as the group paddled through a wide, mirror-still section of river, the water ahead of them suddenly erupted with movement. A herd of caribou, dozens of them, was crossing the river directly in their path. The boys stopped paddling and drifted in silence, watching the massive animals wade through the chest-deep water, their antlers held high, their breath coming in heavy clouds. The only sound was the splash of hooves and the deep, rhythmic breathing of creatures that had been making this crossing for thousands of years. Alex sat frozen in the bow of his canoe, his paddle resting across his knees, his heart hammering. He felt like he was witnessing something ancient, something that belonged to a time before roads and cities and electricity. That night, Augie opened his journal and wrote a single line. "Today I understand why I am here." On another evening, the northern lights appeared. They came without announcement, as they always do, a faint green shimmer on the horizon that slowly grew into great curtains of emerald and violet light rippling across the sky. The group lay on their backs on a gravel bar beside the river and watched in complete silence. Mike Brandt, who always had something to say about everything, said nothing at all. For the first time since the trip began, the wilderness was not something to be endured. It was something to be revered. Alex lay there, staring up at the lights dancing above him, and felt a peace so deep it almost hurt. Every blister, every bug bite, every freezing night and empty stomach seemed to dissolve in the glow of that sky. The beauty of this place was not gentle. It was overwhelming, almost violent in its intensity, and it demanded to be felt. But beauty and danger are two sides of the same coin in the wild, and the coin was about to flip. What was coming would test not just their bodies, not just their skills, but the very core of who they were. And none of them had any idea. Back in Minneapolis, Karen Messenger had stopped sleeping through the night. She would wake at 2 or 3 in the morning, her mind racing, her chest tight with a formless dread she couldn't name. It wasn't that she had received bad news. She hadn't received any news at all, and that silence was worse than anything she could have been told. She began reading every article she could find about the Canadian wilderness. Canoeing accidents, bear encounters, hypothermia cases, rescue operations that succeeded, and ones that didn't. Each article fed her fear, and each fear bred another. Uncle Mike noticed. He started coming by the house more often, sometimes 3 or 4 times a week instead of just weekends. He brought stories of successful expeditions, of young people who had gone into the wild and come back stronger, wiser, more alive. He told Karen that Alex had good instincts. "I know because I taught him," he said, and his voice carried the steady confidence of a man who believed in his own training. But later that night, after he had gone home, Mike sat alone in his living room, staring at a photograph on the mantel. It showed Alex at 10 years old, holding a fishing rod beside a lake, grinning with a gap-toothed smile. Mike looked at that photograph for a long time. He knew the northern tundra. He had trained there during his years in the Guard. He knew that the land up there did not forgive mistakes, and he knew that no amount of training could prepare a person for everything. He whispered into the quiet room, barely loud enough to hear himself. "Be careful out there, kid."
On the 29th day, the landscape had changed so completely that it no longer resembled the country they had paddled through at the start. The boreal forest was gone. The tall spruce and birch trees that had lined the riverbanks for hundreds of miles had thinned, shrunk, and finally disappeared altogether, replaced by an endless expanse of open tundra that stretched in every direction like the surface of another planet.
The horizon was a single unbroken line, flat and infinite, with nothing to interrupt it except the occasional low ridge of glacial rock or a cluster of dwarf willow bushes no taller than a man's knee. The ground beneath their feet was a thick carpet of moss, lichen and tundra grass, spongy and damp, crisscrossed by shallow streams that appeared and vanished without logic. The sky above was enormous, a pale vault of gray and blue that pressed down on the land with a weight you could almost feel. Out here, there was nowhere to hide. Not for the boys, and not for anything else.
They had covered more than 400 miles since leaving their starting point in Manitoba, and the cumulative toll was written on every one of them. Their clothes were stained and patched, their hands were calloused and cracked. Their faces had taken on the lean, wind-burned look of people who had been living outdoors for a month. But they were still moving, still paddling, still functioning as a team. And there was a quiet pride in that. Dylan checked the map that morning and estimated they were roughly on schedule, which was the closest thing to good news they had received in days. They made camp that afternoon beside a narrow creek that fed into the main river, a spot where the ground was slightly elevated and dry enough to pitch their tents without sinking into mud. JP cooked a thin stew from the last of their dried beans and a single pike he had caught earlier that day. It wasn't much, but it was hot, and after weeks of diminishing rations, hot food felt like a luxury. The group ate in tired silence, watching the low sun trace a long, slow arc across the tundra sky.
This was Grizzly country. Dylan had mentioned it several times over the past few days, reminding everyone to keep their bear spray within reach at all times, to store food away from the tents, and to never wander far from camp alone. The barren-ground grizzly, he explained, was a different animal from the forest grizzlies most people imagined. These bears lived on the open tundra, where there were no trees to climb, no dense brush to disappear into. They were the undisputed apex predators of this landscape, and they were accustomed to having no competition. A barren-ground grizzly did not flee from humans the way a black bear might. It assessed you, decided whether you were a threat or a curiosity, and acted accordingly. Dylan said all of this in his usual measured tone, not trying to frighten anyone, just making sure the information was understood. Alex listened carefully. He had his bear spray clipped to his belt, a small canister about the size of a water bottle, and he had practiced drawing it several times during the trip. He felt prepared. But preparation and reality are two very different things, and the distance between them can be measured in heartbeats. After the meal, as the others settled into their evening routines, Alex stood up and walked away from camp. He needed to relieve himself, a mundane task he had performed dozens of times over the past month without a second thought. He clipped the bear spray to his belt, pulled on his jacket, and headed toward a low rise about 200 meters from the tents. The ground was soft underfoot, the tundra grass whispering against his boots. The air was cool and still, carrying the faint smell of wet earth and distant water. He passed over the rise, descended into a shallow depression, and circled around a patch of dwarf willow that grew in a dense tangle along the edge of a dry stream bed. He was thinking about nothing in particular. Maybe about the remaining miles ahead of them. Maybe about home. He was not thinking about bears. And then he saw it. 30 meters ahead, standing in the middle of an open patch of tundra grass, was a grizzly bear. It was enormous. Even from that distance, Alex could see the massive hump of muscle above its shoulders, the broad, dish-shaped face, the silver-tipped fur that rippled across its back like brushed metal. The bear's head was down, its nose pressed to the ground, sniffing at something in the grass. It had not yet noticed him. Alex's entire body locked. Every muscle, every joint, every nerve froze in place as if someone had flipped a switch inside him. His heart slammed against his ribs so hard he was certain the bear could hear it. In that fraction of a second, everything Uncle Mike had ever taught him came flooding back in a single compressed burst. Do not run. A grizzly can cover 100 meters in 6 seconds. You cannot outrun it. Do not make eye contact. Direct eye contact is a challenge. Back away slowly. Speak in a low, calm voice so the bear knows you are human and not prey. Do not scream. Do not make sudden movements. Stay calm. Stay calm. Stay calm. Alex began to back away. His legs felt like they belonged to someone else, stiff and clumsy, barely obeying the commands his brain was sending. He whispered into the still air, his voice shaking so badly the words came out broken. Hey bear, easy. I'm going away. Easy now. He took one step back, then another. His hand drifted toward the bear spray on his belt, fingers fumbling for the safety clip. The bear raised its head, its small dark eyes locked onto Alex with an intensity that stopped his breath. Its nose lifted, nostrils flaring, sampling the air. For one suspended moment, nothing moved. The boy and the bear stared at each other across 30 meters of open tundra, and the world held its breath. Then the bear charged. There was no growl, no warning bluff, no standing on hind legs. One instant it was still. The next instant it was coming. A 700-pound mass of muscle and fur and bone hurtling across the ground at a speed that defied its size. Alex had read that a grizzly could run 35 miles per hour. Reading it and seeing it are not the same thing. The bear closed the distance in what felt like 2 heartbeats. Alex's hand never reached the bear spray. There was no time. Instinct, pure and ancient and hard-wired into every cell of his body, took over. He dropped to the ground, curled into a ball, locked his fingers behind his neck, pressed his face into the dirt, and made himself as small as he could. Protect the neck, protect the belly, play dead, do not fight back. Uncle Mike's voice echoed in his skull like a recording on a loop, and he obeyed it with every fiber of his being. The impact was like being hit by a car. The bear's jaws closed on the back of Alex's head, and the pressure was beyond anything he had ever imagined. It was not pain, not at first. It was pure mechanical force, a crushing compression that made his skull feel like it was being squeezed in a hydraulic press. He heard a sound, a wet, grinding crunch that might have been bone or might have been teeth, and then a blinding white flash of pain shot through his entire body like an electric current. The bear shook him. His head snapped sideways, his body ragdolled, and for a moment he lost all sense of direction, all sense of self. He was nothing but pain and noise and the hot, rancid breath of the animal on his neck. Then the jaws released, and the claws came. The bear raked its paw across Alex's back and shoulder, and he felt the fabric of his jacket tear like wet paper, followed immediately by the searing sensation of his own skin splitting open. Warm blood spilled down his back, soaking into his shirt, pooling beneath him on the cold ground. He bit down on his own tongue to keep from screaming. Every cell in his body was shrieking at him to run, to fight, to do something, anything. But he held the position. He stayed curled. He stayed still. He played dead. The bear stopped. It sniffed him again, pressing its nose against his back, against his neck, against his blood-soaked hair. Alex could feel the hot air from its nostrils on his skin. He did not breathe. He did not move. He did not exist. He was nothing. He was dirt. He was already dead. The bear pushed him once with its muzzle, a casual shove that rolled him slightly to the side. And then, with a low grunt, it turned and walked away. The heavy footsteps grew quieter, softer, until they blended with the wind, and the silence of the tundra swallowed everything. Alex did not move. He lay face down in the grass, blood running into his eyes, his back on fire, his skull throbbing with a pain so deep it felt like it came from inside his brain. He did not know how long he stayed there. Minutes, maybe longer. He was afraid that if he moved, the bear would come back. He was afraid that if he didn't move, he would bleed to death in this empty, beautiful, indifferent place where no one would find him until it was too late. Eventually, slowly, he opened his eyes. The world was a smear of red and green and gray. Blood had pooled in his eye sockets, turning everything into a crimson blur. He raised one trembling hand and touched the back of his head. The skin was torn open. He could feel the edges of the wound, the raw exposed tissue beneath, the warm wetness of fresh blood still seeping through. The adrenaline was still pumping, holding the worst of the pain at bay, but he knew that wouldn't last. He needed to get back to camp. He needed help. He needed it now. He forced himself to his feet. The world tilted violently, and he nearly went down again, but he locked his knees and steadied himself with sheer willpower. The camp was a few hundred meters away. On any other day, it was a 2-minute walk. Today, it might as well have been a marathon. He took a step, then another. Blood dripped from his head onto the tundra grass, leaving a trail of dark red drops on the pale green moss. He did not call out. If the bear was still nearby, a shout might bring it back. So he walked in silence, one agonizing step at a time, swaying like a man on a ship's deck in a storm. When he staggered over the last rise and the camp came into view, Dan Fisher was the first to see him. Dan had been crouched by the creek, washing the cooking pot, and when he looked up and saw Alex lurching toward them, his face drained of all color. The pot slipped from his hands and clattered against the rocks. He shouted. One sharp, ragged shout that brought every head in camp snapping around. "Alex!" They were all on their feet in an instant. Dylan, JP, Mike, Augie, all of them running toward the blood-covered figure stumbling into camp. Alex saw their faces, a blur of wide eyes and open mouths and terror, and he felt his legs finally give out. He collapsed into their arms, and as the world began to darken at the edges, he whispered the only words that mattered. Bear, Grizzly, behind the hill. Then everything went black. The silence that followed Alex's collapse lasted no more than 3 seconds, but to the 5 boys kneeling around their fallen friend, it stretched into an eternity. The tundra wind moved through the camp without sound, as if the wilderness itself had drawn a breath and was holding it, waiting to see what these teenagers would do next.
Alex lay face down in the moss, his arms limp at his sides, blood soaking into the ground beneath his head in a dark, spreading stain. His breathing was shallow, rapid, and uneven, the kind of breathing that comes from a body teetering on the edge of shock. Augie was the first to freeze. The youngest member of the group stood 3 feet from Alex's body, his thin frame rigid, his hands trembling at his sides, his wire-rimmed glasses slightly askew on his pale face. His eyes were wide open, unblinking, fixed on the blood that matted Alex's hair and ran in thin streams down his neck. He had seen injuries before, scrapes and bruises and the occasional bloody nose on the school playground, but nothing in his 16 years of life had prepared him for this. This was not an injury.
This was devastation. The back of Alex's head looked like something had tried to peel it open, and the sight of it locked every joint in Augie's body, as if someone had poured concrete into his veins. 3 feet away, Mike Brandt turned sideways and vomited. The boy who had kept the group laughing through every miserable, rain-soaked, hunger-gnawed day of the past month dropped to his knees in the moss and emptied his stomach in 3 violent heaves. His curly red hair hung over his face, and his shoulders shook with something that was not just nausea, but the raw, unprocessed terror of seeing his friend torn apart by an animal that could still be somewhere nearby, watching them from behind the next rise. Only 2 members of the group held steady. Dan Fisher, the oldest, moved first. His face had gone white when he first saw Alex staggering into camp, but by the time he reached the boy's side, something had shifted behind his eyes. The panic was there, buried deep, but it was locked behind a wall of the same quiet, unshakable composure that had defined Dan since the first day of the trip. He knelt beside Alex, placed 2 fingers against the side of his neck, and felt for a pulse. It was there, fast and thready, but there. Dan looked up at Dylan and nodded once. Alive. Dylan Park was already moving, the semi-professional guide, lean and angular, his sun-bleached hair pulled back tight, dropped to his knees on the other side of Alex with the controlled efficiency of someone whose training had taken over in place of emotion. His face was calm, but his jaw was clenched so tight the muscles stood out like cords beneath his skin. He leaned close to Alex's head, gently turning it to the side, and examined the wound. What he saw made his stomach drop. The scalp on the back of Alex's head had been torn away in a large flap, peeled back like the page of a book, exposing the pale white surface of the skull beneath. The bone appeared intact, no visible fractures, but the wound was enormous, at least 6 inches across, and bleeding heavily. Below the head wound, 2 deep claw marks ran from Alex's left shoulder diagonally down toward the middle of his back, each one more than a foot long, the skin and tissue split open to reveal the dark red muscle underneath. Blood was flowing freely from all 3 wounds, pooling in the moss and soaking through Alex's shredded jacket, but it was not spurting. No arterial spray. That meant the major blood vessels were still intact, which was the only piece of good news in an otherwise catastrophic situation. Dylan's mind raced through the wilderness first aid course he had taken before the trip. Step 1, control the bleeding. Step 2, prevent infection. Step 3, keep the patient conscious. He looked up at the 4 faces staring at him, each one wearing a different shade of shock, and he started giving orders. JP, get the first aid kit, now. Dan, boil water as much as you can and let it cool. Mike, I need every clean shirt, every clean cloth we have left. Bring it all. Augie. He paused. The boy was still standing, frozen, staring. Augie, look at me. The boy's eyes shifted slowly from Alex's wounds to Dylan's face. I need you to kneel down here and hold Alex's head tilted to the side so the blood doesn't run into his eyes. Can you do that? Augie swallowed hard. His Adam's apple bobbed in his thin throat. Then he nodded, lowered himself to his knees beside Alex's head, and placed his small, cold hands on either side of his friend's face. His fingers were trembling, but his grip was steadier than he expected. He held on and did not let go. The first aid kit was a basic backcountry model designed for blisters, small cuts, sprains, and headaches. It contained a few rolls of gauze bandage, a small bottle of antiseptic solution, medical tape, a pair of blunt scissors, and a handful of over-the-counter painkillers. There were no sutures, no antibiotics, no surgical instruments, no blood-clotting agents. It was the kind of kit that could handle a scraped knee or a twisted ankle, and it was now being asked to save a boy's life in the middle of one of the most remote places on Earth. Dylan opened it, laid out the contents on a clean bandana, and went to work. He started with the head wound. Using water that Dan had boiled and cooled to a safe temperature, He gently irrigated the torn scalp, flushing away the dirt, grass, and debris that had been ground into the exposed tissue when the bear shook Alex like a rag doll. Each rinse revealed more of the wound, and each revelation made the situation look worse. Small fragments of tundra moss and soil were embedded deep in the tissue, and Dylan had to use the blunt scissors as makeshift tweezers to pick them out one by one. Alex groaned. His eyelids fluttered. The pain of the antiseptic solution touching raw flesh dragged him back toward consciousness, and he made a sound that was half whimper, half scream, muffled against the ground. Dylan murmured to him without stopping his work. "I know it hurts. I know. Stay with me, Alex. You're going to be okay." JP stood beside them, holding the single flashlight they had brought, its beam aimed at the wound as the tundra sky darkened toward its long, dim version of night. His olive-skinned face was drained of color, pale as paper, and his dark eyes were glassy with suppressed emotion, but his hand holding the light did not waver. He stood there for the entire 2 hours it took Dylan to clean, dress, and bandage Alex's wounds, never once asking for a break, never once looking away. When Dylan finished with the head wound, pressing thick pads of gauze against the torn scalp and wrapping bandage around Alex's head in tight, overlapping layers, he moved to the back. The claw marks were deep. Deeper than Dylan had hoped. The tissue was split open to the muscle layer, and in places he could see the glistening fibers of the latissimus and trapezius muscles that had been raked apart by claws designed to tear apart logs and flip boulders. He cleaned them the same way, slowly and methodically, irrigated with boiled water, cleared of debris, treated with the last of the antiseptic, and covered with every remaining piece of clean gauze and cloth they had. After nearly 2 hours, Dylan sat back on his heels and exhaled. His hands were shaking now, the adrenaline that had kept him focused finally receding, leaving behind a bone-deep exhaustion and the full weight of what he had just done and what still needed to be done. The bleeding had been controlled. The wounds were bandaged. Alex was alive and semi-conscious, mumbling incoherent words into the moss. But the situation was dire beyond anything Dylan had faced in his life. The head wound needed stitches, dozens of them, in a sterile environment with proper equipment. Out here, in the open tundra, with dirt and bacteria and the ever-present moisture in the air, infection was not a possibility. It was a certainty. The claw marks on the back were deep enough to have damaged the underlying muscle, and if infection entered the bloodstream, sepsis could set in within days. Without antibiotics, sepsis in the wilderness was a death sentence. Dylan knew this. He didn't say it out loud, but he knew it. Dan Fisher appeared at his side. The two of them walked a few paces from the group, out of earshot, and Dan asked the question in a low, steady voice that betrayed none of the fear behind it. "Honestly, how bad is it?" Dylan was quiet for a long moment, staring at the darkening horizon where the tundra met the sky in a line so straight it looked drawn with a ruler. Then he spoke. "If we don't get him to a doctor within the next few days, he might not make it. Infection out here, I have nothing to fight it with. Nothing." Dan's eyes moved to the small yellow case strapped to the side of Dylan's pack. The satellite emergency beacon, their single thread of connection to the outside world. "What about that?" Dylan explained. The beacon could send a distress signal, a one-way transmission that would relay their GPS coordinates to a rescue coordination center. But they were deep in the tundra, hundreds of miles from the nearest road or airstrip. Even if a helicopter was dispatched immediately, the terrain and weather in this region made landing unpredictable at best and impossible at worst. They activated the beacon. Dylan pressed the button, watched the small red light begin to flash, and felt the signal leave them like a prayer sent into a void. Whether anyone would come, and how soon, was something they could not know. The group gathered around the fire, 5 faces lit by flickering orange light, each one drawn tight with fear and exhaustion. Dylan laid out 2 options. Option 1, stay here, keep Alex stable, and wait for rescue. The risk was that rescue might not come, or might not come in time, and Alex would die of infection in a tent on the Tundra. Option 2, load Alex into the largest canoe and paddle north as fast as physically possible toward a small indigenous settlement that Dylan had marked on his map weeks ago. A village of Dean and Cree people, remote but inhabited, where there might be medical supplies, a radio, or at the very least someone who could help. The village was roughly 5 to 6 days of paddling under normal conditions. If they pushed hard, paddling from dawn to dark with minimal rest, they might make it in 3 to 4. The silence that followed was heavy. The fire crackled. The wind moved across the tundra with a low moan. And then Augie spoke. The youngest, the quietest, the boy with the swollen ears and the waterproof journal, and the iron stubbornness that had carried him through every terrible day without complaint. He looked up from where he sat, his thin face lit by the fire, his glasses reflecting the flames, and said 5 words that settled the matter. "We paddle. Alex won't die here." No one argued. No one offered an alternative. They looked at each other across the fire, and the decision was made. They would paddle. Back in Minneapolis, Karen Messenger woke at 3 in the morning from a nightmare she couldn't fully remember. Something about Alex calling for her, his voice echoing through an empty forest, growing fainter no matter how fast she ran. She sat on the edge of her bed, her heart pounding, her nightgown damp with sweat, and stared out the window at the dark suburban street below. For the first time since the trip began, she spoke the words aloud. "Something is wrong. I can feel it." The next morning she called Uncle Mike. He listened without interrupting, the way he always did, and when she finished, he said, "Don't worry too much, but I'll call the program and check in." He phoned the expedition's organizing body and spoke to a coordinator, a polite woman named Ellen, who assured him that the group was currently in a communication dead zone and that this was completely normal and expected according to the itinerary. Everything was on schedule. There was nothing to worry about. Mike thanked her and hung up. When he relayed the conversation to Karen, his voice carried a confidence that did not quite reach his eyes. That evening, after dinner, after the dishes were washed and the house was quiet, Mike Messenger went to his garage. He pulled his old military rucksack from the shelf where it had sat untouched for years, unzipped it, and methodically checked the contents. Water purification tablets, fire starters, a compact first aid kit, a folding knife, paracord. He checked each item, then zipped the bag closed and placed it back on the shelf. He could not have explained why he did this. It was not a plan. It was not a decision. It was instinct, the same instinct that had kept him alive during his years in the Guard, the instinct that told him something in the air had shifted, and that it was better to be ready for nothing than to be caught off guard by something.
Before dawn on the 30th day, the camp was broken in near total darkness. There was no discussion about breakfast, no lingering over coffee, no checking the map for scenic detours. Every second counted now, and every one of them knew it. The tents came down in minutes. The packs were loaded with mechanical efficiency, hands moving from muscle memory in the gray half-light before sunrise. The canoes were dragged to the water's edge and loaded with everything they had left, which, after a month in the wilderness, was not much. And in the center of the largest canoe, wedged between 2 packs to keep him from rolling, Alex Messenger lay wrapped in the sleeping bag with his head propped on a folded backpack. His face was the color of old wax. His eyes were closed. The bandages around his head were stained dark brown where the blood had soaked through overnight, and the ones on his back had stuck to the wounds in a way that Dylan chose not to disturb.
Moving him from the tent to the canoe had taken all 5 of them working together, lifting him as gently as they could while he groaned and muttered words that made no sense. Once he was settled, Dan Fisher pulled his own jacket off and laid it over Alex's chest, tucking the edges around his arms. The morning air was cold enough to see breath, and Dan would spend the rest of the day paddling in nothing but a thin, long-sleeve shirt, his arms prickling with goosebumps, his jaw clenched against the chill. He did not complain. He did not even mention it. The formation was set. Dan and JP took the large canoe carrying Alex, Dan in the stern steering, JP in the bow, paddling and watching over Alex between strokes. Dylan and Mike took the second canoe, Dylan navigating from the stern with the map case wedged between his knees, scanning the river ahead for the fastest channels and the safest lines through any rough water. And Augie took the third canoe alone. It was the first time in the entire trip that the 16-year-old had solo paddled a canoe, and under normal circumstances, Dylan would never have allowed it. A solo canoe in wilderness river conditions was inherently dangerous, harder to control, easier to capsize, and if something went wrong, there was no partner to help recover. But there were no normal circumstances anymore. There were only 5 functioning paddlers, 3 canoes, and a dying boy who needed to be somewhere else as fast as humanly possible. Augie said nothing when Dylan told him the plan. He simply picked up his paddle, walked to the third canoe, and pushed off from shore with a single hard stroke. His thin arms looked barely strong enough to lift the paddle, let alone drive a canoe through current for hours on end. But his face, lit by the first pale light of morning, carried an expression that none of them had seen on him before. It was not determination. It was something harder than that. It was refusal. Refusal to accept that this was how the story would end. They paddled faster than they had ever paddled. The rhythm was relentless, stroke after stroke after stroke, paddles biting into the dark water and pulling back in a cadence that never slowed. Dylan set the pace from the front, and the others matched it without being asked. The river cooperated for the first several hours, running swift and deep in the direction they needed to go, the current adding precious speed to every stroke. A tailwind picked up by mid-morning, pushing against their backs, and for a few hours the canoes seemed to fly across the water. They covered more distance before noon on that first day than they had covered in any full day of the trip so far. But by afternoon, the rain came. It was the same cold, horizontal rain that had tortured them during the 3-day storm weeks earlier, driven by wind that found every gap in their clothing and filled it with ice water. The temperature dropped. The river surface turned choppy. Dan pulled his soaked shirt tighter around his shoulders and kept paddling, his face set in a grim mask that never changed expression. Below him in the canoe, Alex lay still, his body shuddering occasionally as the cold rain soaked through the sleeping bag. Every time the canoe struck a rock or lurched sideways in the current, Alex made a small sound, a whisper of pain that JP heard but could do nothing about. During their first brief stop, Dylan knelt beside Alex and carefully lifted the edge of the head bandage. The bleeding had stopped, but the skin around the wound was angry red and swollen, hot to the touch. The early signs of infection. Dylan replaced the bandage, said nothing to the others, and pushed the canoes back into the water. That first night, they stopped for only 4 hours. Dylan divided the darkness into watch shifts, not because of bears, though the threat was still real, but because someone needed to sit beside Alex through the night, monitoring his breathing, giving him small sips of water when he was conscious enough to swallow, changing the bandages if the blood soaked through. Augie volunteered for the first shift. He sat cross-legged beside Alex in the dim interior of the tent, listening to the labored, rattling rhythm of his friend's breathing, and he whispered to him. He talked about school, about the teachers they both knew, about Augie's younger sister who was afraid of thunderstorms, about the pizza place near Alex's house that made the best pepperoni in Minneapolis. He talked about nothing and everything, keeping his voice low and steady because he had read somewhere in one of the wilderness survival books he devoured before the trip that injured people need to hear familiar voices, that the sound of someone who cares can anchor a person to consciousness when their body is trying to pull them under. He didn't know if it was true. He did it anyway. The second day was worse. By mid-morning they reached a stretch of rapids that Dylan's map classified as Class 3, moderate difficulty for experienced paddlers in unloaded canoes. With a severely injured passenger lying across the hull of the heaviest canoe, it was potentially catastrophic. Dylan made the call immediately. The 2 lighter canoes would run the rapids first to scout the safest line. Then they would return on foot along the bank, attach ropes to the large canoe, and guide it along the shoreline through the shallow water at the edge of the rapids, bypassing the worst of the white water entirely. It was slow. It was brutal. They spent nearly 3 hours wading through knee-deep water over slippery rocks, hauling the heavy canoe inch by inch along the bank, while the river roared beside them, and the spray soaked them to the bone. Mike lost his footing twice and went under, coming up gasping and cursing, his red hair plastered to his forehead. But he grabbed the rope again and kept pulling. They made it through without capsizing, and when the rapids were behind them and the river opened back into flat water, Dylan allowed himself exactly 30 seconds to sit on the bank and close his eyes before ordering everyone back into the canoes. Alex's fever began that afternoon. It came on fast, a furnace heat radiating from his skin that JP could feel through the sleeping bag when he placed his hand on Alex's chest. Alex's eyes, when they opened, were glassy and unfocused, seeing things that weren't there. He began to talk, not in coherent sentences but in scattered fragments. He called for his mother. He called for Uncle Mike. He said things that had no connection to anything, strings of words that tumbled out of his delirium like leaves in a gust of wind. Dylan checked the first aid kit. The painkillers were nearly gone. There were no antibiotics, no fever reducers strong enough to combat what was happening inside Alex's body. JP soaked a cloth in river water and laid it across Alex's forehead, the only treatment available to them, and it was barely a gesture. Mike Brandt, paddling in the canoe behind them, watched Alex's limp form through the rain and cried for the first time on the trip. He turned his face away so no one would see, but his shoulders shook. And Dan, paddling beside him in the next canoe, noticed. Dan reached across the gap between the boats and placed his hand on Mike's shoulder. He didn't say a word. He just squeezed, once, firm and steady. It was all he could offer, and it was enough. The third day brought headwinds, a strong, sustained gust blowing directly against them from the north, turning the river surface into a field of small, choppy waves that slapped against the bows of the canoes and cut their speed in half. They had to fight for every yard of forward progress, their paddles digging deep, their arms screaming with fatigue. The blisters on their hands, which had formed in the first week and hardened into calluses by the second, now split open and bled. The paddle shafts grew slick with a mixture of water and blood. Augie, alone in the third canoe, paddled with a face contorted in pain and exhaustion, his glasses fogged, his small body rocking with each stroke. Twice he nearly dropped his paddle when his grip failed. Each time, he looked over at the canoe carrying Alex, watched the still form lying in the bottom, and something inside him caught fire. Again. He tightened his bleeding hands around the shaft and kept going. That night, the third night of the evacuation, Dylan spread the map on the ground beside the fire and measured distances with his thumb. They were 40 to 50 miles from the village. One hard day of paddling. If they left before dawn and didn't stop, they could reach it by late afternoon. But Alex was deteriorating visibly. His fever was higher, his pulse rapid and weak, a fluttering beneath the skin that felt more like a vibration than a heartbeat. The wound on his head had begun to smell, a sour, sickly odor that Dylan recognized from his training as the unmistakable sign of tissue beginning to break down. He did not share this observation with the group. He knew what it meant. If they did not reach the village tomorrow, there was a very real chance that Alex would not survive another night. Dylan gathered them around the fire. 5 exhausted faces stared back at him, hollow-eyed and drawn, lit by the orange flicker of flames that seemed too small and fragile against the enormous darkness of the tundra. "Tomorrow is the day," he said. "We paddle from first light until we get there. No lunch stop. We eat in the canoes. We drink in the canoes. We do not stop for anything. We will get there." Dan nodded. JP nodded. Mike nodded. Augie, his eyes red-rimmed from exhaustion and tears he hadn't quite managed to hide, nodded. Day 4. Day 33 since they had left Manitoba. They broke camp at 4 in the morning, loading the canoes by the light of a single headlamp, their movements stiff and slow from cold and fatigue, but driven by something deeper than physical energy. They pushed off into water that was black and still. the sky above them a dark dome, just beginning to lighten at the eastern edge. No one spoke. The only sounds were the dip and pull of paddles, the drip of water off the blades, and the low whistle of wind across the open tundra. Alex lay in the bottom of the lead canoe, motionless except for the occasional tremor that ran through his body like a small earthquake. His breathing was shallow now, each breath a thin, reedy sound that JP monitored by keeping one hand on Alex's chest while paddling with the other. The hours crawled. Morning became midday. Midday became afternoon. The landscape scrolled past in an endless repetition of tundra grass, low ridges, and empty sky. Their arms moved mechanically, beyond pain, beyond exhaustion, operating on a fuel source that had nothing to do with calories or rest. In the middle of the afternoon, when the sun had begun its long western slide and the shadows had started to lengthen across the water, Dylan stood up in his canoe. He shielded his eyes with one hand and stared at the horizon, squinting against the glare. And then he shouted, "Smoke! I see smoke!" On the distant edge of the world, where the flat line of tundra met the pale sky, a thin column of gray smoke rose into the air. It was barely visible, a thread of haze that could have been mistaken for a wisp of cloud, but Dylan knew what it was. Fire meant people. People meant help. The reaction was instantaneous. Every member of the group burst into tears at the same moment, a simultaneous release of fear and hope and exhaustion that had been building for 4 days. And then they paddled. They paddled harder than they had at any point in the entire journey, harder than they had paddled through the rapids, harder than they had paddled against the headwinds, their arms churning, their paddles slashing the water, their canoes surging forward with a desperate, almost violent energy. 2 hours later, the first buildings appeared on the riverbank. They were small, simple structures, wooden houses with tin roofs, scattered along the shoreline in no particular order. Smoke rose from chimneys. A dog barked somewhere. A child's voice called out in a language none of them understood. They had reached the village. Back in Minneapolis, the call came on the same evening the group had activated the emergency beacon. Karen Messenger was sitting in the living room, pretending to watch television, when the phone rang. The voice on the other end belonged to a program coordinator, a man whose name Karen would never remember, because the only words that registered were the ones that mattered. "We've received an emergency distress signal from your son's group. We don't yet know the specific situation, but we are in contact with rescue services." Karen's legs gave out. She sank into the chair behind her, the phone pressed to her ear, her vision narrowing to a pinpoint. Dan was beside her in an instant, his arm around her shoulders, his face white as chalk. She told him what she'd heard, and for a long moment neither of them could speak. Uncle Mike arrived within the hour. He had not been called. He simply appeared at the front door, as if something had told him he was needed, which perhaps it had. He was the only one whose voice remained steady. "An emergency signal means they're alive and asking for help," he said, standing in the kitchen with his hands flat on the table, his eyes moving between Karen and Dan. "That's good news. It means the system is working. It means someone knows where they are." His words made sense. His logic was sound. But after Karen had gone to bed, and Dan had retreated to the bedroom to sit on the edge of the mattress and stare at the wall, Mike stayed. He sat alone at the kitchen table, his big hands clasped together in front of him, his head bowed, and for the first time in more years than he could count, he prayed.
The canoes scraped against the gravel bank with a sound that none of them would ever forget. It was not a dramatic sound. It was quiet, almost gentle, the soft grinding of aluminum on stone. But it meant everything. It meant they had arrived. It meant the river was done with them. It meant that somewhere in the cluster of small wooden buildings ahead, there might be someone who could save Alex Messenger's life.
The village was small, no more than 24 structures scattered along the riverbank in the loose, organic pattern of a community that had grown according to need rather than design. The houses were simple, single-story wooden frames with corrugated tin roofs, most of them painted in faded colors, blues and reds and greens, that had been bleached by decades of tundra sun and Arctic wind. Smoke curled from several chimneys, thin gray ribbons that rose straight up in the still afternoon air before dissolving into the pale sky. A few boats were pulled up on the shore, overturned and resting on log cradles.
Fishing nets hung drying on wooden racks. Somewhere behind the nearest house, a dog barked, a single, sharp note that echoed across the water and then fell silent. The people who lived here were Diné and Cree, indigenous communities whose families had inhabited this stretch of the northern waterways for generations beyond counting. They knew the river the way a musician knows an instrument, intimately and instinctively, and they knew what it looked like when the river sent someone to them who was in trouble. They came out quickly. A man in rubber boots and a heavy flannel shirt was the first to reach the bank, followed by two younger men and a woman carrying a child on her hip. They took one look at the canoe, at the blood-soaked bandages wrapped around the head of the boy lying motionless in the hull, at the 5 hollow-eyed teenagers who could barely lift their paddles, and they understood.
No lengthy explanation was needed. The man in the flannel shirt shouted something over his shoulder in Cree, and within minutes more villagers appeared, moving with the calm, purposeful urgency of people who had dealt with emergencies in remote places before. They helped lift Alex from the canoe, 4 adults carrying him as carefully as if he were made of glass, and they brought him up the bank toward a small building set slightly apart from the others. The building was the village medical station, and the woman waiting inside was Margaret Blackwood. She was in her late 50s, a Dean woman with broad shoulders, strong hands, and a face that carried the quiet authority of someone who had spent 30 years being the only medical professional within 100 miles. Her hair was steel gray, pulled back in a tight braid that hung over one shoulder. Her eyes were dark and sharp, the kind of eyes that assessed a situation in seconds and wasted no time on panic. She wore a simple blue medical smock over a flannel shirt, and around her neck hung a stethoscope that looked like it had seen as many years of service as she had. Margaret was not a doctor. She was a nurse, trained decades ago at a regional program in Thompson, Manitoba, and she had stayed in this village ever since, because someone had to. She had delivered babies, set broken bones, treated frostbite, managed infections, and talked more than a few people through the worst moments of their lives, all from this one small room with its single iron frame bed, its wooden cabinet of basic medications, and its 2-way radio mounted on the wall. She took charge of Alex the moment he was carried through the door. She cut away the bandages that Dylan had applied, examined the wounds with steady, unhurried hands, and her expression told the story before she spoke. The head wound was severe, a large section of scalp torn away, the exposed tissue inflamed and showing the early stages of infection. The claw marks on his back were deep, the surrounding skin red and hot, with a faint smell that confirmed what Dylan had already feared. Margaret cleaned the wounds thoroughly, irrigating them with antiseptic solution from her cabinet, debriding the dead and damaged tissue with instruments that were basic but functional. Then she did the thing that mattered most. She opened the small refrigerator in the corner of the room, retrieved a vial of injectable antibiotics, and administered the first dose directly into Alex's bloodstream through an IV line. She started with the practiced ease of someone who had done it 1,000 times. She hung a bag of saline solution from a hook on the wall and connected it to the line, letting the fluid drip steadily into his dehydrated body. She checked the head wound again, shook her head slowly, and told Dylan what he already knew. The scalp needed sutures, many of them, and the work was beyond what she could do here. She crossed the room to the 2-way radio, picked up the handset, and contacted the regional medical center in Thompson. Her voice was calm, factual, and precise as she described the patient's condition, the nature of the injuries, and the urgent need for evacuation. The response came quickly. A float plane would be dispatched the following morning, weather permitting. It was the only aircraft capable of landing on the river near the village, and it would transport Alex to Thompson, where he could be stabilized before being flown to Winnipeg for surgery. While Margaret worked on Alex, the villagers took care of the others. The 5 boys were led to a nearby house where a long wooden table had been set with food. Hot fish chowder, thick and steaming, made from pike caught that morning. Fresh bannock bread, golden brown and still warm from the oven. sweet black tea in heavy ceramic mugs. It was the first hot meal any of them had eaten in days, and the taste of it, the simple, overwhelming comfort of warm food in a warm room, undid something inside each of them. Augie ate one bowl of chowder, set down his spoon, laid his head on his folded arms, and fell asleep at the table within seconds. His thin body slumped forward, his glasses pushed crooked against his forearm, and no one woke him. They let him sleep because he had earned it more than any of them. Dan Fisher carried his bowl outside, sat on the wooden porch of the house, and looked out at the river. The same river that had carried them 400 miles, that had nearly killed them, that had been their road, and their enemy, and their lifeline all at once. He sat there for a long time, alone, and cried without making a sound. The tears ran down his wind-burned cheeks and dripped onto the wooden planks, and he let them come because there was nothing left to hold them back. Mike Brandt went to the medical station. Margaret let him in, and he knelt beside the iron bed where Alex lay, eyes closed, IV dripping, chest rising and falling in a rhythm that was steadier now than it had been in days. Mike took Alex's hand, the same hand that had gripped a paddle beside him for a month, and held it. "You made it, man," he whispered. "I'm proud of you." The float plane arrived the next morning, a red and white de Havilland beaver that circled the village once before, settling onto the river with a spray of white water. The pilot, a weathered man in his 60s with a thick mustache and a battered leather jacket, had been flying supply and medical runs in the Northern Territories for decades. He helped load Alex onto a stretcher and secured him inside the small cabin. Margaret handed the pilot a sealed envelope containing her medical notes and a list of the medications she had administered. Then Alex was in the air, the village shrinking below him to a cluster of dots on the vast green canvas of the tundra. He was taken first to the hospital in Thompson, where doctors stabilized him, administered stronger antibiotics, and assessed the full extent of his injuries. Then he was transferred by air to Winnipeg, to a hospital with surgical teams that specialized in the kind of traumatic wounds he had sustained. Karen Messenger, Dan Messenger, and Uncle Mike had flown to Winnipeg overnight and were waiting when the aircraft landed. They had not slept. They had barely spoken during the flight. Karen had spent the hours staring out the window at the darkness below, her hands clasped so tightly in her lap that her knuckles were white, praying to a god she hadn't spoken to in years. When they wheeled Alex through the hospital corridor, Karen saw her son for the first time in over a month. The boy on the stretcher was barely recognizable. His face was swollen and bruised, mottled with purple and yellow. His head was wrapped in professional medical bandages that covered the entire back of his skull. His body, always lean, was now gaunt, the bones of his cheeks and collarbones pressing against skin that looked too thin to contain them. He had lost weight that a 17-year-old could not afford to lose. Karen's legs buckled. She caught herself on the wall, then moved forward and placed both hands on her son's face, her palms against his cheeks, her tears falling onto his skin. Alex's eyes opened. They were glassy and unfocused, but they found her. He looked at his mother, and the faintest ghost of a smile crossed his cracked lips. "I'm home, Mom," he whispered. Dan Messenger stood behind his wife, one hand on her shoulder, the other reaching down to take his son's hand. His lips were pressed together in a tight line, his jaw clenched, every muscle in his face working to contain the emotion that was breaking through anyway. The tears came silently, running down the creases of his weathered face, and he did not wipe them away. Uncle Mike stood at the far end of the room, leaning against the wall, his arms crossed over his broad chest. His eyes were red, but his mouth held a small, steady smile, the smile of a man who had sent a prayer into the darkness and received an answer. Alex underwent 2 surgeries. The first addressed the scalp wound, where surgeons spent hours carefully reconstructing the torn tissue and closing the massive laceration with more than 60 stitches. The second surgery focused on the deep claw wounds on his back, removing infected tissue, repairing the torn muscle fibers of the latissimus and trapezius, and closing the long gashes with layers of sutures that would leave permanent scars. The recovery was measured not in days, but in months. Weeks in the hospital, followed by months of physical therapy at home in Minneapolis to regain mobility in his left shoulder, where the deepest claw marks had damaged the underlying muscle. The nightmares came regularly, vivid and terrible. Dreams in which the bear returned, in which he couldn't run, in which the sound of teeth grinding against bone echoed inside his skull long after he woke. A psychologist diagnosed post-traumatic stress disorder and began working with him weekly, helping him build a framework for processing what had happened without being consumed by it. But Alex Messenger was not defeated. Slowly, with the support of his family and the steady, quiet presence of Uncle Mike, who came to sit beside his bed every afternoon, sometimes talking, sometimes reading, sometimes just sitting in comfortable silence, Alex found his way back to himself. He came to understand that the scars on his head and back were not marks of failure. They were proof that he had survived, that he had faced the worst thing the wilderness could throw at him, and had not been destroyed by it. Months later, when he was strong enough to write, Alex sent letters to each of his 5 friends. The letter to Augie read, in part, "You were the smallest one in the group, but you were the biggest one that night. You never gave up, and that's why I'm still here." Augie read the letter alone in his bedroom, sitting on the edge of his bed with the paper trembling in his hands, and he cried. Then he pinned the letter to his bedroom wall, right next to the page from his waterproof journal, where he had written, on a night that now felt like a lifetime ago, "Today I understand why I am here." The following summer, the 6 of them reunited. Not for an expedition, not for a test of endurance or a journey into the unknown. They gathered at a lake near Dan Fisher's family cabin in Minnesota, and they did the most ordinary things imaginable. They grilled hot dogs. They drank lemonade. They sat in lawn chairs by the water and told stories that only the 6 of them could understand. Stories that made them laugh until their sides ached and cry until their eyes stung. They talked about the river, about the rapids, about the mosquitoes and the rain and the caribou crossing. They talked about the bear. And they talked about the 4 days of paddling that came after, the days that no one outside their circle would ever fully comprehend. As the sun dropped behind the tree line and the lake turned from gold to copper to black, Alex looked around the circle of faces lit by the campfire. Dan, steady and quiet as always. JP, poking the coals with a stick, a half smile on his face. Mike, in the middle of a story, gesturing wildly. Dylan, leaning back in his chair, watching the sky. And Augie, small and serious behind his glasses, writing something in a new notebook. Alex looked at each of them, and he felt something rise in his chest that was too large for words. Gratitude did not cover it. Love did not cover it. It was something deeper, something that lived in the space between all of those words, in the place where language ends and feeling begins. The experience changed everything about the way Alex Messenger saw the world. He was no longer afraid of failure, no longer afraid of pain, because he knew what it felt like to face death and choose to keep living. He understood now that the real value of life was not found in comfort or safety, but in the connections between people. A hand held in the darkness. A voice whispering through the night when everything seemed lost. A love so stubborn and fierce that not even the cruelest wilderness on earth could break it. Alex Messenger survived. Not because of a miracle, but because he had 5 friends who were willing to paddle through hell to bring him home. And that, perhaps, is the most beautiful story the Canadian wilderness has ever told.
And that is the story of Alex Messenger, a boy who walked into the wilderness at 17 and came back a different person. Not because the bear changed him, but because the people around him refused to let him go. If there is one thing I hope you take from this story, it is this. You do not have to be in the Canadian tundra to save someone. Sometimes saving someone looks like a phone call at the right moment. Sometimes it looks like sitting with a friend in silence when they have nothing left to say. Sometimes it is just showing up, not with answers, not with solutions, but with your presence. That is enough. That has always been enough.
We are all paddling through something. Some days the river is calm. Some days the rapids come out of nowhere and the wind blows against you and your arms ache and you want to quit. On those days, look beside you. Someone is there. And on the days when you are strong, look beside you again. Someone needs you to paddle for them.
Alex survived because 5 friends chose not to give up. That choice did not require superhuman strength. It required love. The kind of love that does not ask questions, does not keep score, and does not wait to be asked. It just shows up and starts paddling.
Thank you for staying with me until the end. If this story touched your heart, share it with someone who needs to hear it today. Leave a comment and let me know where you are watching from. If you have not subscribed yet, go ahead and hit that button so you do not miss the next story. And if you believe, like I do, that there is a hand that guides us through the darkest valleys, type Amen in the comments below. May God bless you. May God protect the ones you love. And may you never paddle alone.
May God bless you, may God protect the ones you love, and may you never paddle alone.